A single grain of white crystal, smaller than a pebble, lighter than a feather, once held the power to topple kingdoms and launch 1,000 ships into battle. Wars were fought over it. Empires rose and fell because of it. Entire cities were built around controlling it. What could possibly be so valuable that medieval lords would sacrifice everything for just a handful of these tiny white treasures? Tonight, we're going to uncover the forgotten story of salt. Not the salt you casually sprinkle on your dinner without a second thought, but salt as it once was. The white gold that shaped civilizations, controlled economies, and literally preserved the medieval world. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. Now settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to journey back to a time when salt was more valuable than gold, and those who controlled it held the power to make or break entire civilizations. This is the untold story of medieval salt monopolies. Chapter 1: Salt's Value. Imagine you're living in the year 1200. There are no refrigerators humming in the corner of your kitchen, no freezers preserving your food for months, no canned goods lining your shelves. When you kill a pig or catch a fish, you have perhaps one day, maybe two at most, before the meat begins to rot and becomes dangerous to eat. This was the reality for every single person in medieval Europe. Food spoilage wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A spoiled catch could mean going hungry for weeks. And then, like magic, came salt. Salt didn't just flavor food. It transformed it. A piece of meat that would rot within hours could be preserved for months, even years, with the right salt curing process. Fish caught in summer could feed families through the harsh winter months. Vegetables could be pickled and stored indefinitely. Salt turned perishable food into lasting wealth. But here's what made salt so extraordinarily precious. Unlike other preservatives, salt didn't just prevent decay. It enhanced flavor, making even the humblest ingredients delicious. A piece of salt-cured bacon didn't just last longer than fresh pork. It tasted better, much better. Salt transformed food from mere sustenance into something approaching luxury. The medieval world quickly realized that whoever controlled salt controlled survival itself, and this realization would reshape entire civilizations. Consider the geography of medieval Europe. Most people lived inland, far from the sea where natural salt could be harvested. Mountain communities might be hundreds of miles from the nearest salt source. For these people, salt wasn't just valuable. It was desperately needed and impossibly difficult to obtain. Salt production in the medieval world was an intricate, labor-intensive process. Along the coasts, workers would flood shallow ponds with seawater during high tide. As the sun slowly evaporated the water over weeks or months, pure white salt crystals would form. These crystals had to be carefully harvested, cleaned, and prepared for transport. Inland, the process was even more complex. Workers would dig deep mines to reach underground salt deposits, often working in dangerous conditions hundreds of feet below ground. The salt had to be extracted, purified, and shaped into blocks that could survive the long journey to market. Think about this for a moment. Every grain of salt that reached a medieval dining table represented weeks of human labor, dangerous working conditions, and expensive transportation across hundreds of miles of rough medieval roads. No wonder it was precious. But salt's value went far beyond simple food preservation. Medieval physicians, following ancient medical traditions, believed salt had powerful healing properties. They prescribed salt baths for skin conditions, salt water for cleaning wounds, and salt mixtures for treating various ailments. Whether these treatments actually worked is debatable, but the belief made salt even more valuable. The medieval textile industry relied heavily on salt as well. Cloth dyers used salt to set colors and prevent fading. Without salt, the beautiful tapestries and clothing that decorated medieval courts would have been impossible to create. Leather workers used salt in the tanning process, transforming animal hides into durable leather goods. Perhaps most importantly, salt enabled long-distance trade in ways that seem almost magical to us today. Before salt preservation, most trade was local. You could only sell what you could transport and consume within a few days. but with salt curing, merchants could load ships with preserved fish from northern Europe and sell them months later in Mediterranean markets. This expansion of trade networks created opportunities for enormous wealth. A merchant who could preserve and transport food across long distances could earn profits that seemed impossible in a world without refrigeration. These profits attracted the attention of rulers and nobles, who quickly realized that controlling salt meant controlling these lucrative trade networks. The salt trade also created some of the first truly international business relationships. Merchants in Venice developed trading partnerships with salt producers in France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. These relationships required complex systems of credit, insurance, and legal agreements that formed the foundation of modern international commerce. As medieval cities grew larger, their salt requirements grew as well. A city of 10,000 people might need several tons of salt per month just for basic food preservation. Multiply this across hundreds of cities throughout Europe, and you begin to understand the enormous scale of medieval salt demand. The transportation of salt created its own economic ecosystem. Specialized salt roads developed across Europe, with entire communities built around serving salt caravans. Inns, stables, warehouses, and security services all emerged to support the salt trade. Some of these salt roads became major transportation routes that are still used today. Salt's value also stemmed from its role in what we might call medieval banking. Because salt was valuable, durable, and universally accepted, it often served as a form of currency. Merchants could accept salt as payment in one location and trade it for gold or silver hundreds of miles away. This flexibility made salt an ideal medium for long-distance commerce. The seasonal nature of salt production added another dimension to its value. Salt harvesting from seawater could only happen during certain months when weather conditions were optimal. This meant that salt supplies fluctuated dramatically throughout the year, driving prices up during shortages and creating opportunities for enormous profits for those who could store salt during abundant periods. Regional differences in salt quality also affected pricing. Salt from certain locations was considered superior for specific purposes. French salt might be preferred for preserving meat, while salt from other regions might be better for textile work. These quality differences allowed salt merchants to charge premium prices for the best products. The medieval guild system also contributed to salt's high value. In many cities, salt merchants formed powerful guilds that controlled who could sell salt, where it could be sold, and at what prices. These guilds often worked closely with local rulers to maintain high prices and exclude competition. As we've seen, salt's value in the medieval world extended far beyond its use as a simple seasoning. It was the foundation of food security, international trade, medicine, and industry. It was so valuable that it attracted the attention of the most powerful people in medieval society. And this is where our story takes an intriguing turn, because once medieval rulers realized how valuable salt truly was, they began to ask themselves a very important question. If salt is this precious, and people need it to survive, what would happen if we controlled all of it? The answer to that question would reshape the medieval world in ways that still influence our lives today. Chapter 2: Monopoly Control. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that one person controlled all the coffee in the world. Every cup you wanted to drink, every bag you wanted to buy, every cafe you wanted to visit. All of it controlled by a single individual who could charge whatever they wanted, sell to whoever they chose, and cut off supply whenever they pleased. This scenario might seem impossible today, but it's exactly what happened with salt in medieval Europe. Clever rulers and ambitious merchants didn't just participate in the salt trade, they took control of it completely. The story of how salt monopolies formed is a fascinating tale of political cunning, economic strategy, and sometimes ruthless ambition. Let's explore how ordinary merchants and shrewd rulers transformed the salt trade into instruments of absolute power. Our journey into monopoly control begins in the Italian city-states, where some of the most sophisticated medieval economies first emerged. Venice, in particular, developed what might be the most successful salt monopoly in European history. The Venetians understood something crucial about salt that other regions had missed. While everyone else was competing to produce salt more cheaply, Venice focused on controlling distribution. They realized that it didn't matter who produced the salt if they controlled how it reached customers. Venice sat at the perfect geographic location to implement this strategy. As a major port city, Venice could import salt from multiple sources. They brought in sea salt from southern France, mined salt from Austria, and even imported exotic salts from distant Mediterranean locations. This diversity of sources gave Venice tremendous leverage over both suppliers and customers. But the Venetians didn't stop at simply importing salt. They created an elaborate system to ensure their monopoly remained absolute. First, they established exclusive contracts with major salt producers, guaranteeing to purchase their entire output at fixed prices. This seemed generous to the producers, who appreciated the security of guaranteed sales, but it also meant that Venice controlled where these producers could sell their salt. Next, Venice used its powerful navy to control salt transportation routes. Ships carrying salt through the Mediterranean had to use Venetian ports, pay Venetian taxes, and follow Venetian trade regulations. Any merchant who tried to bypass Venice found their ships mysteriously delayed, their cargoes subject to extensive inspections, or their crews denied access to crucial supplies and repairs. The Venetian government also implemented strict licensing requirements for salt merchants. Only approved traders could sell salt within Venetian territory or to Venetian customers. These licenses were expensive, required political connections to obtain, and could be revoked at any time. This system ensured that even independent salt merchants ultimately depended on Venetian approval to do business. Perhaps most cleverly, Venice created artificial scarcity even when salt was abundant. They built enormous salt warehouses where they could store millions of pounds of salt indefinitely. When market prices were low, they would purchase vast quantities and store them. When prices rose, they would release just enough salt to meet demand while keeping prices high. This strategy allowed Venice to profit during both abundant and scarce periods. The results of this monopoly were staggering. Venice became one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, with salt profits funding magnificent palaces, powerful military forces, and artistic achievements that still inspire us today. Venetian salt merchants lived like kings, with some individual families accumulating wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms. But Venice wasn't the only region to recognize salt's monopoly potential. In France, King Philip the Fair implemented what became known as the Gay Bell, perhaps the most comprehensive salt monopoly in European history. The Gay Bell system was brilliantly ruthless in its simplicity. The French crown declared that all salt production within French territory belonged to the king. Private individuals could not produce, transport, or sell salt without royal permission. Anyone caught violating these restrictions faced severe penalties, including imprisonment, heavy fines, or even execution. But the Gay Bell went far beyond simply controlling salt production. The French government also mandated salt consumption. Every household was required to purchase a minimum quantity of salt each year, regardless of whether they actually needed it. This forced consumption ensured steady revenue for the crown even during periods when people might prefer to reduce their salt usage. The French crown appointed royal salt inspectors who had almost unlimited authority to search homes, businesses, and travelers for illegal salt. These inspectors could enter any building at any time, confiscate suspected contraband salt, and arrest anyone they believed was violating salt regulations. The fear of these inspections became a constant presence in French daily life. Regional variations in the Gay Bell made the system even more profitable and oppressive. Different regions of France were charged different prices for the same salt, sometimes varying by as much as 300%. People living near salt-producing areas might pay relatively modest prices, while those in distant regions faced crushing salt taxes that consumed significant portions of their income. The Gay Bell also created a complex system of internal customs borders within France. Salt purchased in one region could not legally be transported to another region without paying additional taxes and obtaining special permits. This meant that French citizens could be arrested and prosecuted simply for carrying salt across invisible administrative boundaries. Enforcement of the gabelle required an enormous bureaucracy. The French government employed thousands of salt tax collectors, inspectors, guards, and administrators. These officials were often among the most hated people in their communities, seen as enforcers of an oppressive system that made basic necessities unaffordable for ordinary families. The economic impact of the gabelle was profound. Salt taxes became one of the largest sources of royal revenue, funding wars, palace construction, and court extravagances. But this revenue came at the cost of enormous hardship for ordinary French citizens, who often spent more on salt taxes than on rent or other basic necessities. Similar monopoly systems emerged throughout Europe, each adapted to local conditions and political structures. In the Holy Roman Empire, various princes and bishops established salt monopolies within their territories. These smaller monopolies were often more flexible than the French gabelle, but they could be equally profitable for their controllers. English salt monopolies operated differently due to England's island geography and different political system. Rather than controlling production directly, English authorities focused on import controls and licensing. Foreign salt merchants had to obtain expensive licenses and pay substantial tariffs to sell salt in English markets. The techniques used to maintain these monopolies were remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period. Monopoly controllers used early forms of market research to understand demand patterns and optimize pricing. They developed complex distribution networks that could adjust supply to different regions based on local conditions and competition. Salt monopoly holders also invested heavily in infrastructure to maintain their control. They built roads, bridges, and warehouses specifically designed to support salt distribution. They established communication networks that allowed them to coordinate supply and pricing across vast territories more effectively than their competitors. The social impact of salt monopolies extended far beyond economics. Monopoly control created distinct social classes within the salt trade. At the top were the monopoly holders themselves, who often became among the wealthiest and most powerful people in their societies. Below them were licensed distributors and merchants who profited from the monopoly system while remaining dependent on the monopoly holders' approval. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the consumers, who had no choice but to pay whatever prices the monopoly demanded. For wealthy nobles and merchants, high salt prices were an inconvenience. For ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, salt monopolies could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and malnutrition, between food security and hunger. Salt monopolies also influenced medieval diplomacy and international relations. Rulers would negotiate salt trade agreements as part of broader political alliances. Access to salt sources became a factor in military planning and territorial expansion. Some medieval wars began as disputes over salt trade rights that escalated into broader conflicts. The technological innovations driven by salt monopolies were also significant. Monopoly holders invested in improved production techniques, better transportation methods, and more efficient storage systems. These innovations often had applications beyond the salt trade, contributing to broader economic development. As monopolies became more entrenched, they also became more creative in maintaining their control. Some monopoly holders deliberately spread misinformation about salt quality from competing sources, claiming that rival salt was inferior or even dangerous. Others used political influence to have competing salt sources declared illegal or unsafe. The psychological impact of salt monopolies on medieval society was profound. People living under these systems developed a deep awareness of their dependence on monopoly controllers for basic survival needs. This dependence influenced political attitudes, social relationships, and economic behavior in ways that extended far beyond the salt trade itself. But monopolies, no matter how cleverly designed or ruthlessly enforced, create their own vulnerabilities. The very success of salt monopolies attracted challenges from excluded merchants, rival political authorities, and ordinary consumers who resented paying artificially high prices for basic necessities. These challenges would eventually lead to conflicts that reshaped the political and economic landscape of medieval Europe. Some of these conflicts were economic, fought with competing trade networks and pricing strategies. Others were political, involving legal challenges and diplomatic negotiations. And some, as we're about to discover, became actual wars. Chapter 3: Salt Wars. There's something almost surreal about the idea of armies marching to battle over salt. Yet throughout medieval Europe, conflicts that historians now call the Salt Wars erupted with surprising frequency and devastating consequences. These weren't minor skirmishes between rival merchants. They were full-scale military conflicts involving thousands of soldiers, sieges that lasted months, and political consequences that lasted centuries. Now, we'll explore three of the most significant salt conflicts in medieval history. Each reveals how the control of white crystals could escalate into bloodshed that changed the course of European development. Our first major salt war began in 1140 between the German city of Lüneburg and a coalition of rival merchants and nobles who wanted to break Lüneburg's monopoly over northern German salt production. This conflict, known as the Lüneburg Salt War, would rage intermittently for over 30 years. Lüneburg had discovered something remarkable beneath their city: vast underground deposits of incredibly pure rock salt, some of the finest quality salt in all of Europe. By 1100, Lüneburg had developed sophisticated mining techniques that allowed them to extract this salt more efficiently than anywhere else in the region. The city's leaders made a crucial strategic decision. Rather than simply selling their salt to the highest bidder, they would control the entire supply chain from mining to final sale. Lüneburg merchants established exclusive contracts with major buyers throughout northern Europe. They built their own transportation networks, funded their own security forces, and even issued their own currency backed by salt reserves. This strategy made Lüneburg incredibly wealthy, but it also made them powerful enemies. Hamburg, Bremen, and other northern German cities watched enviously as Lüneburg prospered, while they struggled with expensive salt imports. These cities formed what they called the Northern Alliance, dedicated to breaking Lüneburg's salt monopoly by any means necessary. The Northern Alliance tried diplomatic pressure first. They petitioned the Holy Roman Emperor to declare Lüneburg's monopoly illegal and force them to sell salt at regulated prices. When these efforts failed, they attempted economic warfare, trying to establish alternative salt supply routes that would bypass Lüneburg entirely. But Lüneburg's response was swift and decisive. They used their salt profits to hire mercenary companies that attacked Northern Alliance salt caravans and disrupted competing trade routes. Lüneburg's private army became so effective that independent salt merchants throughout northern Germany had to pay tribute to Lüneburg for safe passage through the region. The situation escalated dramatically in 1140 when Hamburg merchants attempted to establish a direct salt mining operation in territory claimed by Lüneburg. Lüneburg's response was immediate and violent. Their mercenaries attacked the Hamburg mining camp, killed several workers, and destroyed months of excavation work. Hamburg declared this attack an act of war and mobilized their militia. Bremen, Lübeck, and several other cities joined Hamburg, contributing soldiers and funding for what they hoped would be a quick military campaign to humble Lüneburg and open their salt markets to competition. But Lüneburg had used their salt wealth wisely. They had built impressive fortifications around their city and salt mines. They had stockpiled weapons, food, and supplies sufficient to withstand a long siege. Most importantly, they had negotiated mutual defense agreements with several powerful noble families who depended on Lüneburg salt for their own territories. The first major battle occurred near the village of Bardowik in September 1140. The Northern Alliance had assembled nearly 3,000 soldiers, an impressive force for the period. Lüneburg fielded about half that number, but their soldiers were better equipped and more experienced, having been paid from salt profits for several years. The battle was brutal and decisive. Lüneburg's heavy cavalry, funded by years of salt monopoly profits, shattered the Northern Alliance's infantry formations. Over 400 Alliance soldiers died that day, including several prominent Hamburg merchants who had personally joined the campaign. But military victory didn't end the conflict. The Northern Alliance regrouped and changed tactics. Instead of direct military confrontation, they began what we might recognize today as guerrilla warfare. Small groups of Alliance soldiers attacked Lüneburg salt caravans, ambushed individual merchants, and sabotaged salt production facilities. This guerrilla campaign proved devastatingly effective. Lüneburg's salt trade, which required predictable transportation along established routes, became increasingly dangerous and expensive. Insurance costs for salt shipments increased dramatically. Many of Lüneburg's customers began seeking alternative suppliers, even if the salt was more expensive or lower quality. Lüneburg responded by escalating their own military efforts. They hired larger mercenary companies and began conducting offensive raids against Northern Alliance cities. These raids targeted not just military facilities, but also civilian infrastructure. Lüneburg forces burned warehouses, destroyed bridges, and even poisoned wells in enemy territory. The conflict reached its most brutal phase during the winter of 1145. Lüneburg forces laid siege to Bremen, surrounding the city and attempting to starve it into submission. The siege lasted 4 months, during which thousands of Bremen residents died from hunger and disease. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of desperate civilians trading family heirlooms for tiny portions of preserved food. But Bremen's suffering galvanized opposition to Lüneburg throughout northern Germany. Cities that had previously remained neutral began providing aid to the Northern Alliance. Even some noble families who had been allied with Lüneburg began questioning whether salt profits were worth such devastating warfare. The turning point came in 1147, when Emperor Conrad III finally intervened directly in the conflict. The emperor had initially avoided involvement, preferring to let the cities resolve their dispute independently. But the escalating violence was disrupting trade throughout his realm and threatening the stability of northern Germany. Conrad III's solution was characteristically medieval in its complexity. He declared that Lüneburg could maintain their salt monopoly within a defined territory around their city, but they had to allow limited competition in more distant markets. The Northern Alliance cities were granted the right to establish their own salt trading operations, but they had to pay tribute to Lüneburg for this privilege. This compromise satisfied neither side completely, but both were exhausted by 7 years of warfare. The final settlement, signed in 1148, established the framework for northern German salt trade that would persist for the next 2 centuries. Our second major salt conflict occurred in France during the late 1300s and involved not competing cities, but the French crown and its own subjects. The Salt Rebellion of 1382, also known as the Maillotins Revolt, erupted when King Charles VI attempted to dramatically increase salt taxes to fund military campaigns against England. The French gabelle system, as we discussed earlier, already imposed heavy salt taxes throughout France, but Charles VI's new taxes would have nearly doubled the price of salt in many regions. For ordinary French families who already spent significant portions of their income on salt, this increase threatened genuine hardship. The rebellion began in Paris when salt merchants refused to collect the new taxes, claiming they were impossible to implement without causing widespread suffering. When royal officials attempted to enforce the tax increases directly, crowds of angry citizens attacked tax collection points throughout the city. The violence escalated quickly. Rebel crowds, many armed with hammers and other tools from their trades, attacked royal officials and destroyed tax records. They ransacked government buildings, freed prisoners who had been jailed for salt tax violations, and declared their intention to resist royal salt policies by force if necessary. Charles VI's response was swift and harsh. He declared the rebels traitors and ordered military suppression of the uprising. Royal forces entered Paris and began arresting suspected rebels, often based on little more than accusations from neighbors or business rivals. But the rebellion had spread far beyond Paris. Similar uprisings erupted in Lyon, Rouen, Orleans, and dozens of smaller cities throughout France. In some regions, rebel forces gained control of salt warehouses and began distributing salt at pre-tax prices to anyone who needed it. The most dramatic incident occurred in Rouen, where rebels captured the royal salt warehouse and discovered evidence of systematic corruption in salt tax collection. Royal officials had been skimming significant portions of tax revenue for personal profit while demanding ever higher payments from ordinary citizens. This discovery transformed the rebellion from a tax protest into a broader challenge to royal authority. Rebels began demanding not just lower salt taxes, but also investigations into royal financial management and punishment for corrupt officials. The rebellion reached its climax in March 1382, when rebel forces from multiple cities attempted to coordinate their efforts into a unified challenge to royal salt policies. They established what they called the Free Salt Alliance, dedicated to establishing fair salt pricing throughout France. But the rebels lacked the military resources to sustain their challenge against royal forces. Charles VI's professional soldiers systematically retook rebel-controlled cities, often with considerable violence. The final major battle occurred outside Orleans, where royal cavalry scattered rebel forces and captured most of their leaders. The suppression of the Salt Rebellion was brutal. Charles VI ordered mass executions of rebel leaders and imposed punitive taxes on cities that had participated in the uprising. Ironically, these punishment taxes were often higher than the original salt tax increases that had sparked the rebellion. Yet the rebellion had lasting consequences. Charles VI realized that salt taxation had practical limits beyond which subjects would risk rebellion rather than compliance. Subsequent French salt policies, while still oppressive, were generally more carefully calibrated to avoid triggering similar uprisings. Our third major salt conflict occurred in the early 1400s between Venice and Genoa, two Italian city-states whose rivalry over Mediterranean salt trade escalated into the War of Chioggia. This conflict began as a commercial dispute, but revealed how salt monopolies could destabilize international relationships. Venice and Genoa had competed for control of Mediterranean trade routes for decades, but their rivalry intensified dramatically when both cities attempted to establish exclusive salt trading rights with the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Emperor, facing financial pressures from Ottoman expansion, had offered exclusive salt trading privileges to whichever Italian city could provide the most immediate financial support. Both Venice and Genoa submitted competing bids, each backed by their salt monopoly profits. Venice's bid was ultimately successful, largely because their salt trade networks generated more reliable revenue than Genoa's more diversified but less predictable trading activities. But Genoa refused to accept this outcome and began diplomatic efforts to undermine Venice's new Byzantine relationship. When diplomacy failed, Genoa resorted to direct action. Genoese naval forces began attacking Venetian salt ships in international waters, claiming they were enforcing their own interpretation of Byzantine trading agreements. These attacks escalated gradually from simple harassment to actual seizure of ships and cargo. Venice's response was characteristically systematic. They assembled a powerful naval fleet, funded largely by salt trade profits, and began convoy operations to protect their merchant ships. These convoys included not just protective warships, but also specialized vessels designed specifically for salt transport. The conflict reached a turning point in 1379 when Genoese forces launched a surprise attack on Chioggia, a Venetian port city crucial to their salt trade operations. The attack was brilliantly planned and initially successful. Genoese forces captured the city, destroyed Venetian salt warehouses, and established a naval base from which they could threaten Venice itself. But Venice's wealth, largely derived from salt monopoly profits, allowed them to respond with overwhelming force. They assembled the largest naval fleet in their history, hired mercenary companies from throughout Europe, and committed enormous resources to recapturing Chioggia. The siege of Chioggia lasted 8 months and involved some of the most sophisticated naval warfare of the medieval period. Both sides used innovative tactics, including underwater obstacles, floating fortifications, and coordinated attacks by land and sea forces. Venice's ultimate victory came not through direct military assault but through economic warfare. They used their superior financial resources, again derived largely from salt profits, to bribe key Genoese allies to abandon the siege. Faced with declining support and increasing costs, Genoa agreed to negotiate a settlement. The Treaty of Turin in 1381 established Venice's dominance over eastern Mediterranean salt trade for the next century, but the cost of this victory was enormous for both cities. Thousands of soldiers and sailors had died, countless ships had been destroyed, and both Venice and Genoa had exhausted significant portions of their treasuries. These 3 conflicts illustrate how salt monopolies could escalate minor commercial disputes into major military confrontations. The enormous profits available from salt control made the stakes high enough to justify substantial military investments. The dependence of entire populations on stable salt supplies meant that disruption of salt trade could have political consequences extending far beyond simple commercial relationships. But salt wars also reveal the inherent instability of monopoly systems. The very success of salt monopolies attracted challenges that monopoly holders had to constantly resist through increasingly expensive and complex methods. Military forces could maintain monopolies for extended periods, but it also increased costs and created additional vulnerabilities. As we'll explore next, the economic impact of these monopolies and the wars they generated extended far beyond the salt trade itself, influencing the development of medieval European society in ways that still affect our world today. Chapter 4: Economic Impact. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. In 13th century Venice, salt taxes generated more revenue than all other trade activities combined. In France during the 14th century, the Gabelle salt monopoly provided nearly 40% of total royal income. Individual salt merchants accumulated personal fortunes that exceeded the treasuries of entire kingdoms. Now we're going to explore how salt monopolies didn't just affect salt prices. They fundamentally altered the economic structure of medieval Europe in ways that shaped the development of modern capitalism, banking, and international trade. Let's begin with perhaps the most dramatic economic transformation. Salt monopolies created some of the first truly international business empires in European history. Before salt monopolies, most medieval commerce was regional or local. Merchants typically operated within a few hundred miles of their home base, trading goods that could be transported and sold relatively quickly. Salt changed everything. Because preserved salt could be stored indefinitely and transported across vast distances without spoiling, salt merchants could develop supply chains that spanned entire continents. A single salt trading operation might include mines in Austria, refineries in France, storage facilities in Venice, transportation networks throughout the Mediterranean, and sales operations from England to Constantinople. These extended supply chains required new forms of business organization that were remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period. Salt merchants developed early versions of joint stock companies, allowing multiple investors to share the costs and profits of large-scale salt operations. They created standardized contracts that could be enforced across different legal systems and currencies. Perhaps most importantly, they developed credit systems that allowed business operations to continue even when payment for goods might not be received for months or years. A salt merchant in Venice might extend credit to a customer in London based on expected future deliveries, while simultaneously receiving credit from suppliers in France based on anticipated future orders. These credit systems became the foundation for medieval banking. Many of Europe's most famous banking families, including the Medicis of Florence, built their initial wealth through salt trade financing. Banks developed specialized financial instruments for salt merchants, including letters of credit, currency exchange services, and insurance policies for salt shipments. The insurance industry, in fact, emerged largely from the salt trade. Salt shipments were valuable enough to justify insurance costs, but they were also subject to numerous risks including storms, piracy, political instability, and simple theft. Insurance providers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for assessing and managing these risks. Salt monopolies also drove innovation in transportation and logistics. Salt merchants invested heavily in improved road construction, better vehicles for salt transport, and more efficient port facilities. They developed standardized weights and measures for salt trading, which became models for other industries. The economic impact extended far beyond the salt merchants themselves. Salt monopoly profits created enormous demand for luxury goods and services. Salt merchants built magnificent palaces, funded artistic projects, and supported elaborate court cultures. This spending stimulated economic activity in construction, manufacturing, and service industries. Salt wealth also influenced medieval education and intellectual development. Salt merchant families often became patrons of universities, libraries, and scholarly activities. They funded translation projects that made classical texts more widely available and supported mathematical and technological innovations that had applications far beyond the salt trade. The social mobility created by salt wealth was unprecedented in medieval society. Traditional medieval social structures were based on land ownership and hereditary status, but salt trade could elevate merchant families to positions of wealth and influence that rivaled ancient noble lineages within a single generation. This social mobility created tensions within medieval society, but also opportunities for economic development. Salt merchants often invested their profits in other industries, bringing capital and business expertise to sectors that had previously operated on much smaller scales. Regional economic development was profoundly affected by salt monopolies. Cities that controlled major salt operations experienced rapid population growth, infrastructure development, and cultural flourishing. Venice, for example, used salt monopoly profits to fund the architectural projects that made it one of Europe's most magnificent cities. Conversely, regions excluded from salt monopoly profits often experienced relative economic decline. Areas that had previously prospered through local salt production found themselves unable to compete with large-scale monopoly operations. This created regional economic inequalities that persisted for centuries. The tax implications of salt monopolies were enormous. Salt taxes provided reliable revenue streams for medieval governments, allowing them to fund military campaigns, infrastructure projects, and administrative expansion. The French gabelle, for instance, enabled the French monarchy to maintain larger armies and more elaborate courts than would have been possible through traditional taxation alone. But salt taxation also created economic distortions that had negative consequences. High salt taxes made food preservation more expensive, forcing many families to accept lower nutrition and food security. This could reduce overall economic productivity as malnourished populations were less capable of sustained physical and intellectual work. Salt monopolies influenced monetary systems throughout Europe. Because salt was valuable, durable, and universally needed, it often served as an alternative currency, especially in regions where gold and silver were scarce. This gave salt monopoly holders significant influence over local monetary conditions. The international trade implications were equally significant. Salt monopolies created some of the first permanent trade relationships between distant regions. These relationships required diplomatic agreements, legal frameworks, and communication systems that became models for broader international commerce. Salt monopoly profits also funded exploration and expansion activities. Venetian salt wealth helped finance Marco Polo's expeditions to Asia. Spanish salt revenues contributed to funding Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas. These explorations opened new trade routes and opportunities that transformed the global economy. The technological innovations driven by salt monopoly profits extended far beyond salt production itself. Salt merchants invested in improved navigation techniques, better ship design, and more efficient communication methods. Many of these innovations had applications throughout medieval commerce and industry. Labor markets were significantly affected by salt monopoly operations. Salt production, transportation, and distribution required large numbers of workers with specialized skills. This created employment opportunities and wage pressures that influenced labor conditions throughout medieval Europe. Salt monopolies also affected agricultural development. Reliable access to affordable salt enabled farmers to preserve meat and dairy products more effectively, which encouraged livestock production and improved agricultural productivity. Farmers could invest in larger herds, knowing they could preserve surplus meat through salt curing. Conversely, high salt prices in monopoly-controlled regions sometimes forced agricultural changes that reduced overall productivity. Farmers might shift from livestock to grain production to avoid salt-dependent preservation methods, even when livestock would have been more profitable under normal market conditions. The manufacturing sector experienced both positive and negative effects from salt monopolies. Industries that used salt as an input, such as textile dyeing, leather tanning, and food processing, sometimes benefited from monopoly holders' investments in salt infrastructure and supply reliability. But these same industries also faced higher input costs that reduced their competitiveness. Salt monopoly wealth contributed to the development of medieval proto-industrial operations. Some salt merchants invested their profits in other manufacturing activities, bringing capital and business expertise that enabled larger-scale production than had been possible before. These early industrial operations often used techniques and organizational methods developed in the salt trade. The construction industry was dramatically influenced by salt monopoly wealth. Salt merchants commissioned elaborate buildings that required advanced engineering and artistic skills. These projects employed thousands of craftsmen and stimulated innovation in architectural techniques. Many of Europe's most impressive medieval buildings were funded directly or indirectly by salt monopoly profits. Financial markets became increasingly sophisticated due to salt trade requirements. Salt merchants needed to manage complex international transactions involving multiple currencies, extended credit periods, and substantial risks. This drove the development of more advanced banking services, including foreign exchange markets and commercial credit systems. The economic data we have from medieval records is incomplete, but what exists is staggering. In Venice during the 1300s, individual salt merchant families sometimes paid more in taxes than entire rural provinces. The wealth concentration was so extreme that a small number of salt trading families effectively controlled significant portions of the Venetian economy. Trade route development was another major economic impact. Salt merchants established transportation networks that were later used by merchants trading in other goods. Many of Europe's major trade routes originated as salt roads and expanded to carry diverse products as these routes became established and secure. Market integration increased significantly due to salt trade activities. Because salt merchants operated across vast territories, they developed price information systems and standardized trading practices that connected previously isolated regional markets. This integration improved overall economic efficiency, but also transmitted economic shocks more rapidly across longer distances. The economic relationships created by salt monopolies influenced political development throughout Europe. Rulers who controlled salt revenues could maintain larger armies, build more impressive capitals, and conduct more ambitious diplomatic activities. This created feedback loops where political power and salt monopoly control reinforced each other. Urban development patterns were shaped by salt monopoly economics. Cities with significant salt trade operations grew rapidly and developed sophisticated commercial districts, financial institutions, and service industries. These cities often became regional economic centers that attracted migration and investment from surrounding areas. Rural economies were affected in complex ways by salt monopoly operations. Some rural areas benefited from salt trade route development, which brought employment opportunities and market access for local products. Other rural regions suffered from labor migration to salt trade centers or from agricultural changes forced by high salt costs. The emergence of what we might recognize as early corporate structures was largely driven by salt trade requirements. Salt operations required large capital investments, complex management structures, and risk-sharing arrangements that led to business organizational innovations. These innovations were later adopted by other industries. Economic inequality increased significantly in regions dominated by salt monopolies. The enormous profits available to monopoly holders created wealth concentrations that were extreme even by medieval standards. This inequality had social and political consequences that extended far beyond simple economic effects. International economic relationships were fundamentally altered by salt monopoly operations. Countries and regions became economically interdependent in ways that had not existed before large-scale salt trade. This interdependence created both opportunities for mutual benefit and vulnerabilities to economic disruption. The economic legacy of medieval salt monopolies extended far beyond the medieval period itself. Business practices, financial instruments, and organizational structures developed for salt trade became foundations for later commercial and industrial development. Some of these innovations are still recognizable in modern international business operations. By the late medieval period, salt monopoly operations had become so economically significant that they influenced monetary policy, international relations, and domestic political stability throughout Europe. The economic systems that emerged from salt monopoly operations became integral parts of the broader transition from medieval to early modern European economic structures. But as we'll discover in our final chapter, the very success of these salt monopolies contained the seeds of their eventual decline. Changes in technology, exploration, and political organization would gradually undermine the foundations of salt monopoly power, leading to the end of an era that had shaped European development for centuries. Chapter 5: Decline of Salt Power. Picture the most powerful business empire you can imagine. An industry so dominant that kings depend on its taxes, armies march to protect its interests, and entire cities rise and fall based on its success. Now imagine that empire crumbling within a few generations, not because of military defeat or political revolution, but because the world simply changed around it. This is exactly what happened to medieval salt monopolies. By 1500, the same salt operations that had funded palaces, launched wars, and shaped international politics were struggling to survive. The age of salt monopolies was ending, and with it, an entire chapter of European economic history. Now we'll explore how technological innovation, geographic exploration, and political change combined to bring down what had seemed like permanent economic empires. The decline began with something that seemed completely unrelated to salt. Portuguese and Spanish explorers, funded partly by salt monopoly profits, were discovering new trade routes to Asia and stumbling upon entirely new continents. These discoveries would eventually destroy the economic foundations that made salt monopolies possible. The first crack in salt monopoly power came from an unexpected direction. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas discovered that indigenous peoples had developed food preservation techniques that didn't require salt. Smoking, drying, and fermentation methods used by Native American communities could preserve food just as effectively as salt curing, often with better flavor and lower costs. More significantly, Spanish colonists discovered that many American foods didn't require preservation at all. Potatoes, corn, and other New World crops could be grown fresh year-round in many climates, reducing the need for preserved foods that had driven medieval salt demand. But the real transformation came with what historians call the Spice Revolution. Portuguese traders who had reached Asia by sailing around Africa brought back not just traditional spices like pepper and cinnamon, but also new preservation techniques and food varieties that reduced European dependence on salt preservation. Asian preservation methods using soy-based fermentation, vinegar processing, and advanced smoking techniques proved superior to salt curing for many applications. These methods often enhanced food flavor more effectively than salt, while requiring less expensive materials. The flood of new spices into European markets also changed food preferences in ways that reduced salt's importance. Spices that had been impossibly expensive during the height of salt monopolies became relatively affordable, as direct Asian trade routes eliminated the middlemen who had previously controlled spice distribution. Technological changes in food production created additional challenges for salt monopolies. Improved agricultural techniques developed during the late medieval period increased food production and reduced the absolute necessity for food preservation. When food was more abundant, the life-or-death importance of preservation declined. The development of better storage methods also reduced salt demand. Improved granary construction, better root cellars, and more effective pest control meant that fresh foods could be stored longer without any preservation treatment. These improvements made salt preservation less crucial for food security. Perhaps most importantly, the invention of the printing press had unexpected consequences for salt monopolies. Printed books allowed preservation techniques, recipes, and food storage methods to spread much more rapidly than had been possible when this knowledge was transmitted orally or through expensive hand-copied manuscripts. Cookbooks and agricultural manuals published in the late 1400s and early 1500s included detailed instructions for preservation methods that didn't require salt. Home preservation techniques that had previously been regional secrets became widely available, reducing consumer dependence on professionally salt-preserved foods. Political changes also undermined salt monopoly power. The rise of stronger central governments meant that rulers were less dependent on salt tax revenue and more capable of challenging monopoly abuses. Kings and princes who had previously relied on salt merchants for financial support could now access alternative revenue sources. The Protestant Reformation created additional political pressures against monopoly systems. Protestant theology's emphasis on individual responsibility and rejection of traditional authority structures made monopolies seem morally questionable to many Europeans. Religious wars funded by monopoly profits became increasingly unpopular among populations influenced by Protestant ideas. The growth of alternative trade networks was perhaps the most decisive factor in salt monopoly decline. As European merchants established direct trading relationships with Asian, African, and American suppliers, they became less dependent on traditional European monopoly systems. New World silver discoveries created monetary changes that affected salt monopolies. The influx of American silver into European markets caused inflation that made traditional salt pricing structures obsolete. Salt merchants found their carefully maintained price controls undermined by broader monetary changes beyond their control. The development of ocean-going navigation technologies made traditional salt transportation monopolies less defensible. Improved ships and navigation techniques allowed independent merchants to establish alternative supply routes that bypassed traditional monopoly-controlled transportation networks. Banking innovations reduced salt merchants' financial advantages. As banking services became more widely available and sophisticated, other industries could access the capital and credit services that had previously given salt merchants decisive business advantages. The rise of joint stock companies and other new business organizational structures allowed competitors to pool resources more effectively. Independent merchants could now organize large-scale operations that competed directly with traditional monopoly systems. Regional political consolidation eliminated many of the artificial scarcities that salt monopolies had depended upon. As larger political units emerged, internal trade barriers that had supported regional monopolies were eliminated. Salt produced in one region could be sold freely throughout much larger territories. Military technological changes reduced the defensive advantages that salt monopoly holders had previously enjoyed. Improved artillery and siege techniques made the fortified cities and installations that protected salt monopolies more vulnerable to attack. The discovery of new salt sources also undermined traditional monopolies. Explorers found salt deposits in locations that had been unknown during the peak of medieval monopoly power. These new sources provided alternative supplies that broke traditional monopoly control. Maritime salt production improvements made ocean-based salt harvesting more efficient and affordable. Coastal communities could now produce salt more cheaply than the underground mining operations that had supported many inland monopolies. Consumer preferences were changing as well. As European diets became more diverse due to New World and Asian food introductions, salt's role as the primary food enhancer declined. People could create flavorful meals using spices, herbs, and cooking techniques that made salt less essential. Economic diversification in salt-dependent regions provided alternative income sources that reduced community dependence on salt trade. Cities and regions that had previously depended entirely on salt revenues developed other industries that provided economic stability without monopoly dependence. The emergence of competitive market ideologies challenged monopoly legitimacy. Renaissance and early Reformation thinkers began articulating economic theories that favored competitive markets over monopoly control. These ideas influenced both popular opinion and government policy. International diplomatic changes reduced the political protection that salt monopolies had previously enjoyed. As European political relationships became more complex and multilateral, the bilateral agreements that had often supported salt monopolies became less sustainable. The gradual decline process was neither rapid nor uniform. Some salt monopolies maintained significant power well into the 1600s. The French Gabelle, for instance, continued generating substantial government revenue until the French Revolution. But even these surviving monopolies operated in increasingly competitive environments that reduced their dominance. By 1550, the golden age of salt monopolies was clearly ending. Salt remained an important commodity, but it was no longer the economic kingmaker it had been for the previous 4 centuries. The political empires, family fortunes, and international relationships built on salt monopoly foundations were adapting to new economic realities or fading into history. The transition away from salt monopoly dominance was often difficult for regions and families that had depended on salt profits. Some former salt merchant families successfully diversified into other industries. Others saw their wealth and influence decline dramatically as salt monopoly profits disappeared. Cities that had prospered during the salt monopoly era had to develop new economic foundations. Venice, for example, gradually shifted its focus from salt trading to other Mediterranean commerce, banking, and manufacturing. This transition was successful but required significant economic and social adjustment. The workers in communities that had supported salt monopoly operations also faced challenging transitions. Salt miners, transporters, and processors had to find alternative employment as traditional salt operations scaled back or closed entirely. The end of salt monopolies had broader cultural implications as well. The social hierarchies, political relationships, and economic assumptions that had developed during the salt monopoly era slowly gave way to new systems based on different economic foundations. By 1600, salt had become what it remains today, an important commodity, but one that operates in competitive markets rather than monopoly systems. The age when salt could determine the rise and fall of empires had ended, replaced by economic systems based on diverse industries, global trade networks, and competitive markets. The legacy of salt monopolies lived on in the business practices, financial institutions, and international trade systems they had helped create. Many of the organizational innovations developed for salt trade became standard features of early modern commerce. The credit systems, insurance practices, and international business relationships pioneered by salt merchants became foundations for broader economic development. Looking back, the decline of salt monopolies represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how technological and geographic changes can transform economic systems. Industries that seem permanent and unassailable can be undermined by innovations and discoveries that initially appear completely unrelated to their core business. The salt monopoly era also demonstrates how economic systems adapt to changing conditions. As salt monopolies declined, the capital, expertise, and institutions they had created were gradually redirected toward new opportunities and industries. If there's a deeper message for our modern world, it might be that even the most successful economic systems eventually face challenges that require fundamental adaptation. The salt merchants who thrived during the monopoly era were those who recognized changing conditions and adapted their strategies accordingly. Those who clung too tightly to traditional methods often found themselves left behind by historical change. As we settle in for sleep tonight, it's worth reflecting on how completely the economic world of salt monopolies has disappeared from our daily experience. The white crystals that once launched wars and toppled kingdoms now sit quietly in our kitchen cupboards, taken for granted in a way that would have amazed our medieval ancestors. But perhaps if we look closely at our own economic world, we can recognize industries and systems that seem just as permanent and powerful as salt monopolies once did. And perhaps, understanding how dramatically economic systems can change, we can better appreciate both the opportunities and vulnerabilities that shape our modern world. As our long journey through the world of medieval salt monopolies comes to a close, it's worth pausing to consider what these forgotten chapters of history might teach us about our own world. We began tonight with a simple question about how ordinary salt could become more valuable than gold. We discovered that salt's value came not from scarcity, but from necessity. In a world without refrigeration, salt meant the difference between survival and starvation, between prosperity and poverty. The merchants and rulers who recognized salt's true importance didn't just participate in salt trade. They took control of it, creating monopoly systems that generated wealth and power beyond anything the medieval world had previously seen. These monopolies funded magnificent cities, launched military campaigns, and influenced international politics for centuries. But salt monopolies also sparked conflicts that reveal how economic control can escalate into devastating warfare. The salt wars we explored weren't just commercial disputes. They were battles over who would control the foundations of medieval economic life. Thousands died fighting over access to white crystals that we now use without a second thought. The economic impact of salt monopolies extended far beyond salt itself. These monopolies created some of the first international business empires, pioneered banking and credit systems, and drove innovations that influenced European development for centuries. They also created extreme wealth inequality and social tensions that shaped medieval political development. Yet perhaps the most important lesson comes from understanding how salt monopoly power ultimately declined. The same innovations and explorations that salt profits had helped fund eventually undermined the economic foundations that made salt monopolies possible. New preservation methods, alternative food sources, and changing consumer preferences gradually reduced salt's crucial importance. This transformation reminds us that even the most powerful economic systems can be disrupted by changes that initially seem completely unrelated. The salt merchants who dominated medieval Europe couldn't have predicted that voyages to find new spice routes would bring back preservation techniques that made salt less essential. If we look at our modern world, we might ask which industries or systems seem as permanent and powerful as salt monopolies once did. What economic relationships that we take for granted might be vulnerable to technological innovations or changing consumer preferences that we haven't yet imagined. The story of salt monopolies also highlights how economic systems shape society in ways that extend far beyond simple commercial relationships. Salt monopoly wealth funded artistic achievements, supported educational institutions, and influenced political development throughout Europe. When salt monopolies declined, these broader social impacts declined as well. Perhaps most importantly, the salt monopoly era demonstrates that economic power ultimately depends on providing something that people genuinely need. Salt monopolies succeeded because salt was essential for medieval life. They declined when salt became less essential due to alternative preservation methods and different food systems. This suggests that sustainable economic success requires continuing to provide real value rather than simply maintaining control over existing systems. The salt merchants who successfully transitioned away from monopoly dependence were those who used their capital and expertise to provide new forms of value as salt's importance declined. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we might reflect on how the medieval world's relationship with salt reveals broader patterns about innovation, power, and change that continue to shape our modern experience. The next time you reach for salt in your kitchen, you might remember that you're touching something that once determined the fate of kingdoms. The white crystals in your salt shaker carry within them the memory of ancient conflicts, forgotten fortunes, and vanished empires. They remind us that our comfortable modern world built on abundant food, reliable preservation, and competitive markets is both more recent and more fragile than we often realize. But they also remind us of human ingenuity and adaptability. The medieval Europeans who created salt monopoly systems were responding creatively to the challenges and opportunities of their time. When those systems became obsolete, later generations adapted and created new systems better suited to changing conditions. Understanding this history might help us approach our own economic challenges with similar creativity and adaptability. The salt monopoly era ended, but the human capacities for innovation, organization, and adaptation that created it continue to shape our world today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, please consider subscribing to our channel and give this video a like. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What surprised you most about the story of salt monopolies? Have you ever thought about how different our lives might be without modern food preservation methods? So as you settle into sleep, perhaps you can appreciate both the remarkable stability of our modern food systems and the long historical journey that brought us to this point. The story of salt monopolies is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, adaptation, and the endless quest to turn basic necessities into opportunities for prosperity and advancement. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten world of medieval salt monopolies.